morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the Data Faces podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by the magnificent Monica Cisneros. She's a rising star in the data analytics and AI sphere and has extensive experience supporting clients around the world. Welcome to the show, Monica.
Thank you, David. I'm super excited to be here. And I love the name Data Faces. It's fantastic.
Thank you. Appreciate it. And so just a little bit about Monica. Her current role, she's the head of AI and data analytics at Fuerza Feminista. Hope I didn't butcher that too bad. But she's had led product marketing for AI at Alteryx, and she's been a solutions consultant at TIBCO, and I've had the good fortune to work with her at a few of these companies. And a little known fact, she's conducted neuroscience research at Harvard prior to her career in tech. But Monica, tell us a little bit more about your current role and what you're doing over at Fuerza Feminista.
So it is a academic project by two professors, one at UTSA and another one at NMSU. And they're looking at feminicides in Ciudad Juarez, so women who we lost to violence. And they are right now doing some research on the mothers and how essentially a very traumatic event, which is like losing a daughter, can lead to advocacy and leads in policy. So I'm helping out with the transcription of these interviews, with the data sentiment analysis, text analysis of the interviews, and then hopefully we're going to be able to have a digital exposition from these stories.
That's fantastic, and it's a pretty, I commend you for doing that. We need more people like you that are doing good in the world and not just selling software. So I'm so appreciative of you, taking that real world experience you've had from working in software and applying it to create goodness in the world. So that's amazing. So the reason we're here, Monica, is you took a class, and we were texting the other day. But before we talk about that class, I do want to ask you about your experience in the neuroscience realm, because I think it's pretty unique. And you mentioned to me that you did some research at Harvard, and you once shared a funny story about the power going out. I was wondering if you could maybe share that with our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So I studied biology in college, and then I was actually en route to do a PhD. I actually got into a PhD program, but I didn't go. So one of the pieces is that I'm an animal lover. And that's why I went into, STEM. And I didn't realize that while I was doing basic research, cell biology, genetics, etc., we need tissue, and we get tissue from animals. And mice are some of the most popular animal models out there. So actually, that is why I quit. But then the funny story is actually related to mice as well. When you do genotyping of the mice, essentially you are grabbing tissue from them, and they are in these animal facilities, right? So like there's thousands of mice at one given room. And as a lot of people know in research, it takes a really long time and it takes a lot of dedication. So one of these times I was late in the lab, and this particular animal facility was in the basement, and I was doing stuff with the mice, and then out of nowhere the light just completely goes off.
Oh boy.
And this is one thing that a lot of people don't know, is that even if you have like a little bit of like reflection light all in the dark, the mice eyes actually reflect. So then like I turn around with my cell phone, and then like all the mice eyes, you can like see them. And I'm like, thousands of mice are looking at me right now. I just completely lost it. I was so scared. And then I was like, okay, I need to get out of here. But then to get out of there, you have to like take off the protective equipment and whatnot, and it was completely dark. And I had to like call somebody. I'm like, please, somebody come and help me after hours. It was certainly one of those times where I was like, I am never gonna go to the animal facility past like 7 p.m. I'm done. Like the 10 p.m. one, I was like, no, not after 7 anymore. And then ultimately, so that is a funny story, but because I had to like work with animals, and unfortunately I had to say goodbye to a lot of animals, that is the reason I decided to not do my PhD. And then I just kind of fell into the tech world and then into the AI rabbit hole too. So there's, the connections from neuroscience to AI, creating, the neural network. So that's really where the connection happened.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I would be scared out of my wits with the beady little eyes and all the critters come to life in the dark. So I think you're in a safer space now. So that's amazing. Thanks for sharing that. I want to talk about this class we were speaking about. AI is such a hot topic out there. And, you took a class, I believe, from Stanford on ethics, technology, and public policy for practitioners. Tell us about it.
Yes. So I actually got affected by layoffs recently. And I was, while I was looking for jobs, I was thinking, hey, look, this is a time for me to take some, accountability in terms of like my learning. And I started reading again. I started to looking at courses, and then this one particularly really called for my attention. So I applied to an AI fellowship for the government, and I started following people from those fellowships. And then this one became advertised through those same people. Is essentially a course that anybody can take. You apply for the course, and then you pay, or you have a scholarship depending on your financial status. And then it's cohort based. They actually have two different ones. They have a cohort, and then they have one that is self-paced. Of course, I took the cohort one. For me, I'm a social learner. I really love learning from other people. So the cohort based type of approach I absolutely loved. And I have a passion of how can AI be used in a fairer way? How can AI be more accessible to a lot of other people, and having more equity across all groups, right? So when I saw this course, I was like, hey, this looks amazing. Let me apply for it. And it wasn't what I thought it was going to be honest. I thought the course was going to be something like, I'm going to get the answers to my questions. And it was really a course where philosophy really takes the driving seat. And in philosophy, if anybody has taken any type of philosophy class, is about asking questions. So then I left with a lot more questions that I had coming in.
So it was way more than the hey, we're pro ethics. It sounds like really challenging assumptions and things like that. And what were some of the key takeaways you got from the course besides more questions?
For me, it was like really the world is very complex, and therefore our application of technology is very complex. Now we're talking about AI, especially with generative AI. That is what brings what everybody has in their head at the moment. So when we apply to that, and we're thinking, this is a moment where a lot of people are actually asking those questions, right? Because it is something new. So when a lot of people ask questions like, oh, how should we implement it? What type of use cases we want to do and whatnot. What I learned from the class was that we should take a step back and actually ask more deeper questions. Like, should we even apply it? What implications happen if we do apply this use case? And then it goes from the impact being positive, being negative, but then there's also a lot of neutral, a lot of gray. And that is something that I feel a lot of people don't talk. They don't really navigate the nuance. They don't navigate that complexity and we're going to talk about a use case about this later, right? Of, you can make something accurate, but it might not be fair.
Sure.
And I do feel that is something that we're missing in the conversation when we're talking about AI. Just like, what does those shades of gray look like?
So there's no right or wrong answer. I mean, whose responsibility is this? I hear you talk to business leaders all over the world as you have as well. And, is it the data scientist or the AI engineer, machine learning engineer? Is it the business leader? Is it everybody? Like, who do you see should own this?
It's funny that you asked about it in terms of like the class. So in the class, we actually had a lot of people come and talk to us from all walks of life. We had practitioners that took the class before. We had lecturers that came and talked to us about the theory and case studies. But then we also had a lot of like leaders. Like we had, VPs from Google. We had people who have created responsible AI practices from huge companies. We had even a prime minister come and talk to us.
Oh, wow.
A little side note that I actually really love about the class is that we had Chatham House rules, and I didn't know what it was. So Chatham House rules promotes openness and information sharing in meetings because they are essentially anonymous. So like they're not recorded, and then essentially everybody in the room agrees that whatever is being said cannot be attributed to a specific person, therefore allowing the people to actually speak on basically like thorny subjects.
Sure.
This was originated in the Royal Institute for International Affairs in London in 1927 to start talking about it. So it comes from international affairs. And to answer your question, I cannot attribute it to a specific person in the course.
Sure.
But I can tell you about what was talked about in the course. And we actually had a lot of conflicting answers to that question.
Okay.
We had a researcher that came and said, well, researchers, academia, we're here to pose the questions, but we're not here necessarily to create the answers. And then we had somebody from, like a really large company and then say like, hey, we're working on all of this, but not everything can be solved. And we need help from, NGOs, and we need help from the government, and need help from, academia. We need people like advocates to like come and help us too. So like what I took away from that is that there's really, again, not a real answer.
Okay.
I feel it's like two takeaways. One of them is, I don't know if you know the concept of hot potato, but like,
of course, yes.
I feel like a lot of people are doing the hot potato dance here too. But
okay.
Then my takeaway personally is I think it's a shared responsibility. Of like personal and institutional, of like taking accountability of like what you create and do, and try to be as collaborative as possible, call people from like all different types of ways of life to like come and help and actually give that. One last thing that we could talk about is one of the people from the cohort itself, we have this thing called action cycles after the class, where you create a project and you take it on into the real world. And she was thinking about essentially creating an AI literacy coalition, because she is seeing that when we ask for help from the general public actually does not have enough maturity in their AI literacy in order to be effective in helping. So what she wants to do is create this coalition to like create campaigns and whatnot to bring the general public to actually, when they do reporting or when they bring, for example, bugs, now that, with AI chatbots and AI agents, every single person on earth is being exposed to AI, be able to know enough to understand where a problem comes from. So therefore, when it brings up to like engineers or like product people, they're able to, fix it quicker.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think, you and I working in tech, we're sort of assume, or I make the assumption a lot that people at a certain level and people who aren't in tech, they're not. There's a lot of fear and mistrust out there, and rightfully so. We've seen lots of examples of AI being used for nefarious things and causing lots of harm. But on the other side, we've seen it used for good. So it's I think up to us to shape our future. But back to the class, you had mentioned a a book or something about a utopian city. What is this book, and what's that have to do with the class? I'd love to. I was not familiar with it, so I'd love to maybe just talk about that a little bit and how that relates to what you're doing in the Stanford class.
Yeah, so the class actually is book. It's called Book Ended. So like it starts and it ends with two short stories. The first one is Ursula's Le Guin's The Ones Who Walk Away from Homeless. And then the other short story is The Ones Who Stay and Fight at Halat. And basically, there's two sides of the spectrum within the story. So, Omelas, both of them are utopias, but they
Okay.
approach the utopias in very different ways. I'm not going to talk too much about Halad, but I do want to touch a little bit more on Omelas. So, with Halad, essentially, is this authoritarian utopia where there are rules that everybody has to follow, and then there's somebody who is questioning that authority, and then it breaks down into a revolution. So that is where we end at Halat. But the one that caught my attention the most was the story about Omelets, because I was surprised of my response to it. So, you know me, I'm, an optimist. I try to like bring energy to like everything
Sure.
that I bring. I'm like always with a smile. But it has definitely been a very hard year. I lost my grandma in April. I lost my job in May. And I had somebody really close to my family be diagnosed with cancer. So like, and my dog was sick on top of it. We
Sure.
thought that she had
Yes.
cancer. Thankfully, she did not. But it was a lot of this year, and I had to, on top of grieving my grandmother, I had to deal with like all the stresses, especially not having a job. And I honestly was in a really dark space. So that's just kind of to put you into context as to like when I started reading the story. So the
Sure.
story is, again, Omelas is a utopia. Everybody's living in complete abundance. But there is a kid who is being tortured. Everybody at Omelas understands that kid needs to be tortured in order for everybody to like live the life that they know and love with that abundance. They don't really go into the why, but it's implicit.
Okay.
So, the story is like some people have the choice and there's a freedom to leave. And a lot like in the story, people do choose to leave Homeless, right? So then as a thought experiment, especially starting in ethics class, is the question about, would you stay and fight? Would you leave? What will you do? And my response, like everybody else was like, yeah, let's fight back. Let's save the kid. Or like, no, you know what? I would leave because I don't want to be complicit into that. And my response was, I would probably do nothing. And the reason for that is, and the reason for that is because I'm taking accountability of like what I would do.
Sure.
And of course, this is a metaphor of the type of life that we're living. We live in a world where there's injustice. We live in a world where, there's so many kids in hunger, so many kids are suffering.
Sure.
Like we do live in an unjust world. And the reality of it is because I myself am dealing with so many issues that like I'm a woman, person of color, I have a disability, I work in tech, all the things that I do are male dominated. I live in the US. Like I have my own problems.
Right.
And for me to like get out and be able to help somebody else is like I need my own oxygen mask, right?
Sure. Yep.
And I feel like I cannot actually grab that mask at the moment because I'm dealing with all these issues, especially like grieving at the moment and grieving both the loss of my grandma and my job.
Sure.
So then I'm like, I cannot grab that mask. And it's like, how could I help a child where I am drowning too? And it's one of those of like, I had to really take I had to take count of where I was, like psychologically and emotionally. And I kind of decided to take a step back and say, you know what, it's okay for me to be and say, I will not help that child right now. And for me was basically taking one step at a time. And by the end of the course, which was like 7 weeks, of creating a community, of creating a cohort, and like learning from other people, that little basically like spark that had are like gone or diminished to like a pretty much darkness, it started reigniting again. It's not the same flame that it was before, but it's starting to like spark back.
Sure.
And I am feeling a little bit more hopeful now finishing the course and learning from all the people than where I was at the start of it.
Well, that's great. I mean, that's I think there's a lot of people in sort of the same boat you are in, and so being able to take that accountability, I guess, and say, hey, I'm not in a state where I can help right now. And I remember taking philosophy in college, and I didn't take a lot of it, but they'd be like, hey, stealing is wrong, right? Everybody's like, oh yeah, you don't want to steal. And so, okay, well, how about a loaf of bread? Yeah, that's wrong. But what if your family was starving? Would you steal? Yeah, I'd probably go get the loaf of bread. And similar thing. This is much more weighty what you're talking about, but there's all these choices, and on the surface they seem straightforward, but when you dive into them, they're a lot more complex, as you mentioned. Shades of gray, and it really does depend on the circumstances. I think each person they find themselves in. But maybe switching to AI and a little bit about this. And we were working on a little document outline for this show, and I saw this comment about fairness, and I brought this up in one of the tiny tech guides I wrote. People are like, yes, AI, we need to be fair, right? Everybody's pro fairness for sure, but there's a lot of mathematical definitions of fairness. So how do you talk a little bit about that and what you took from that from the class?
Yeah. So before I took the class, the way that I thought fairness was very black and white, right? Either something's fair or something's not fair. But then when you're trying to measure, when you're trying to do algorithms, when you're trying to measure the impact of X, Y, Z, you have to use math for that. And the second lecture that we had, I think that's the one that like really resonated with me as a technologist, was that there are 21 mathematical definitions of fairness. So like it's not even about like ethical fairness or like philosophical, no, mathematical definitions of fairness. And we went through like a couple, but there's 21. Like that's crazy, right? So like you think maths is like black and white and like you only have like one solution and you're ready to go. It's like, no, there's mathematically 21 definitions of fairness. So I thought that was crazy. And I'm going to go over a case study to actually explain like what this means in practice, right? So, because a lecture had all these definitions of fairness simultaneously, there's a case where like you can improve classification parity, which means that you're equalizing the error rates across all groups that you're measuring. But when you increase that classification parity, so like every time that you are equalizing those errors, your calibration goes down. So calibration is that the risk score that you have everywhere is the same across all groups, right? So like the error, the least that you're like making the errors or like equalizing all the errors across all groups, that means that the risk score is changing, right? So like, and if you do the opposite, it happens the same, right? So like if you're, hey, let me equalize the risk scores, like then your errors are like all over the place. So it's this thing called the Kleinberg's theorem, where essentially it just doesn't work that way. And there's a real world example of this. This is a very famous case study called COMPAS. And essentially when they launched it, it was great. Like, it's like, hey, like this is like fair. And like we have like 61% of correctly prediction. And essentially, this algorithm, what it did was that it predicted recidivism. So, like, recidivism is when somebody goes to jail and they are going to commit another crime and then they go to jail again.
Sure.
So they were predicting 6 out of 10 times the recidivism rate of a person. But then when you broke it down by race, it was more accurate on Black defendants. So why do you think is that? And then we go and break it down in terms of like what that mathematical fairness looks like. So you have disparities between false positives and the false negatives. So with the false positive is when they were predicting a high score of reoffending, but the person did not reoffend, right? So like, hey, this person is going to reoffend, but they didn't. That's a false positive, right?
Sure.
So they saw that for the Black defendants, the false positive rate was 45%, and white defendants, the false positive was 23%. What that means is that the Black defendants were twice as likely as white defendants to be incorrectly labeled as high risk.
Okay.
So in layman's terms is that this algorithm was saying Black people are going to commit the crime more often than white people. Like that's essentially kind of where the false positive was going to be. And it didn't. It was just basically false. And then you go into the false negative rate, right? So like this means that the algorithm that predicted low risk of reoffending, so the people who like are least likely to go back to jail, but the person did commit another crime, right? So like they actually did go to jail
Right.
afterwards. And for Black defendants, this false negative rate was 28%, and for white defendants, the false negative rate was 48%. What that means is that defendants, the white defendants were that did commit another crime were far more likely to be labeled as low risk. So like if you're white, you're low risk and then you commit another crime. Whereas with like Black people or like the Black defendants, it was, hey, you're classified as higher risk, but you did not reoffend. So that is where like both of those concepts come in terms of the fairness, right? The false positives and then the false positives and the false negatives. So really the takeaway of this case study is that there is that inherent tension between the definitions of fairness in machine learning, right? So when decision makers are confronted in basically, you as a judge, right? You're like, okay, I'm like looking at this algorithm. How much can I trust this algorithm to help me make a decision?
Sure.
And decision makers have to always question what the algorithm is telling them, because although it was at surface level like a fair algorithm at the beginning, when you look deeper, it was actually not. It was biased against Black people in both those scenarios of false positives and false negatives. So with we can have equal you have to check what matters the most, right? Either the equal error rates or an accurate calibration. And that is one thing that we don't talk about is the trade-offs of these like mathematical algorithms that indeed affect people's lives.
Yeah, that's I think that's a tricky one, and that, if you think about it, and there's lots of other examples, beyond the recidivism, we see this in medical, we see it with even images that are generated, we see it in translation services, like there's gender neutral languages out there, and if you say, what's a doctor, and it comes out, he is a doctor, and there's no gender in some of these languages, or she is a nurse, and there's these things that perpetuate. But how, like, if people see something, and we've seen so much social media out there, once you see it, people tend to believe it, even if they know it's incorrect or false. So, like, do you have any thoughts on how you would approach this for the people consuming this? So I think there's a responsibility of the developers and the AI engineers and things. They need to do something, but in this case of the judge, do we need to give them, there's X% chance, but your error bars are, 100, whatever, really wide. I'm just curious, like, what's the solve here? Because you can't people just believe things, they see them, even if they know that be false. There's lots of psychology experiments to that talk about that fact.
Yeah, and I think that the answer is as complex as the question, right? In my personal opinion, I think that there are multiple things that we can do. In my education journey, a lot of my professors really created emphasis into critical thinking. And I fear that in a lot of like the education might be missing that a little bit, where you're able to like poke holes and like question the status quo. In a lot of places that is not well seen, because it they want you to like basically go ahead and memorize facts, right?
Sure.
And so I have been privileged enough to like have an education that really values critical thinking and like questioning everything around you. It can honestly, I can make you miserable sometimes.
Right.
But I do think it's like a very good skill to have as a human, just general. So reading on what critical thinking is and practicing every day on critical thinking is something that I really call for anybody to do. When you read a book, a lot of people read books like self-help books, or like, hey, I'm reading about XYZ, whatever. Notice the errors. What can something be better? Ask questions about like, is what this book telling me, or like, is what this video telling me actually true? How can I see it from a different side? I think that having and asking those questions in every type of media that you consume is extremely important as a human going around. And then another topic is going into AI literacy. I do think that there are a lot of nonprofits, especially in the US, that are dedicated to this. So consuming and sharing that information for AI literacy or like digital literacy is very important. And then, of course, with and I can talk about this a little bit later. There's this concept called the Turing Trap that I can go into later. But in the case of a Turing Trap, is really questioning what the development of what I'm going to do, does it have any like long-term effects? And me as a developer, how can I shape the society? Sometimes, especially when we're individual contributors, we think that we don't have power. But in reality is that even if we do not have the authority from like a title or, being a manager or something like that, we still have influence.
Sure.
And standing and having those tough conversations with, your manager or your chain of command, or, your leadership is something very important when you go in and develop these systems.
So, and that's Turing of like the Turing test. Is that where that trap
this
from?
This is another thing I learned in class.
You're a fountain of knowledge right now, Monica. So I'm learning a lot from this discussion.
So yes, actually, David, why don't you explain to the audience what is a Turing test, and then I can go forward with the Turing trap.
Yeah, I think essentially the Turing test was it was a test that if you could convincingly emulate or pretend you're a human, a robot, pretend you're human. If you could convince a human that they were real, then that was the Turing test, and that was sort of like the gold standard in computer science for quite a while. I think it's been beaten quite, especially with Gen AI right now. So we're like, hey, we passed the Turing test. Like, well, now what? It's been talked about and debated for so long.
Yes.
And now we're past it, and like, oh well, maybe that wasn't really the gold standard for is this an intelligent, artificial general intelligence, or whatever terms you want to use there. But I find it interesting because we're past it. Any of these, Claude or ChatGPT can convince anybody that they're human. And
exactly. So I mean that is essentially so that the Turing test is essentially, can you tell if it's a human and machine? That's a test, right? The Turing trap that I learned in class was that essentially what you described, right? Like the gold standard of machine learning as a developer is to make it as human as possible. And basically the class and like the speaker that introduced the concept was like, well, is it the golden
Right.
golden standard? Like, do we want to do that? And I feel like this, that actually bleeds into a little bit of like, what is the future of labor in AI, right? If
Mhm.
we make AI more human, we're creating more competition for humans, right? So like if you want AI to like do art and do music and do, creative writing, it's like, well, then what are humans gonna do that is something uniquely human, right? And you get to the point where like you might displace workers, you might displace people from their job. And there's a lot of conversation about this, right? Some people say like, oh no, don't worry about it, like AI is not going to displace people, like people are going to get displaced by people using AI.
Sure.
Personally, I feel that that is completely false, because like there are jobs that literally are being replaced by AI, like people who are doing like who are note takers, people who like do like data entry, people who basically do copy edit, like all of that is being replaced by AI. Translations are getting replaced by AI.
Sure.
And they might not, like I have my own thoughts about translation. I don't think that you can get to the point where you're honing another language because it has cultural references, but it's getting there and it's really good. And I actually use ChatGPT. So I do meditations in the morning, but I like to do my meditations in Spanish. But I
Okay.
give my prompts in English and then the AI returns it back in Spanish. So
Okay.
like it already works that way. So, like I do think that like as developers, as like people who work in like product development for technology, we have to ask ourselves if what we're building, beyond the bottom line, bring that question to senior leadership and say, is this the best thing that we can do right now? Or can we use our resources and our knowledge to build something to shape our new society?
Yeah, it's very interesting on the is AI going to take my job? I wrote a blog on this, and is AI going to take my job? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. And the conventional wisdom was, hey, well, every industrial revolution out there, it's created more jobs than it's destroyed. And there's this, hey, AI is going to make everybody more productive. I had this hypothesis that maybe productivity isn't the best measure of a human. We're not machines. That's how that started. It's like you want machines to be more productive, but with all the advancements I've just seen in my career in technology, I'm more busier than ever. I don't have this 4-day work week or free time that everybody says. I think what companies, they're like, oh, well, we can do more with less. And so now they have less staff working essentially. That's better for their profit. But then that just taxes the people doing the work because you're just hopping around from task to task to task. So I don't know what the right answer is. I think I'm an optimist. So I think there's a lot of potential for AI to improve society, but you have to be careful with it. It can make
Yeah.
things go faster, and it's not gonna. It doesn't have really original thought, right? It's just gonna parrot back whatever's been trained on. I wrote another blog called, you're ready for generative AI mediocrity. So if you want to be mediocre, great, let Chat GPT write your essay without thought, and that's what you'll get. You're going to get an average response. And I think people that are creative and can bring their creativity and their passion to it, they can use it as an accelerator and add their own unique things on it. And the high performers will be even higher performers, but people that don't take that extra initiative, I think they're going to be have a rude awakening, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. So, David, I have a few questions for you.
Uh-oh, I'm scared.
Yes. Like, David, you have been such a big supporter of my career. And throughout my career, I have noticed that there are three different types of supporters, right? You have your coaches, you have your mentors, and you have your sponsors. What's your view on lifting the voices that you traditionally don't see in leadership spaces? And how do you, as a manager, help them create a voice and expand their influence?
Well, Monica, first of all, thank you for the kind words. It's been a pleasure to see you grow in your career. I feel what my only job really as a manager, number one, is to get the people that are working with me and for me, get them to where they want to go in their career. Like I want to be their biggest cheerleader. I mean, obviously there's the work stuff. We want to um, do what's right for the company, but without the people, you have no company. And so if people are not happy, if they're not in the right role, or if they're not given opportunities to make a difference, it's not going to be good for the company. So I feel like that's like one of my only job is to get people where they want to go. And obviously, there's the we want to get focused on the business outcomes, but it's getting the people to where they want to go.
Amazing. Thank you, David. Another question for you, and this actually comes from the class. In class, we talked a lot about power, and we talked a lot about like leadership, especially like executives in very high positions and whatnot. And there was a concept that the leadership thinking shifts, and it becomes thinking about the business outcomes and the bottom line. Since you have extensive experience working with executives, the question is, at what point does a senior leadership experience shift in thinking? And there's a lot of people who are early in career that prioritize global and social concerns. I know, I am one of them. Like a lot of people, that I work for in, those entry level or like IC positions, they really, go into this. But those senior leaders are thinking about business outcomes. Do you think it's selection bias, or do you think it reflects an evolution in the mindset over time for these leaders going from, I see early in career to where they are at, whether they are board members, like C-level, VPs, etc.?
That's a really interesting question, Monica. And I think in my mind, maybe this is a bit cliche, but with age comes wisdom. How's my hair, by the way? See, I don't have any. But I think, you're right. I think when you're earlier in career, you have sort of a project-based focus. And so you can take that project and you can do your best and put all your energy at that project or initiative, and you can be an expert in it. And as you move up in your career to different levels, now you have a portfolio of projects and you have other concerns like, you want to make sure your employees are taken care of. You have to worry about budgets. There's a bunch of other things that you need to consider. So I feel like that, I think there's just more things that you have to weigh as a manager as you go up your career. And then you also been I'll say gun shy a little bit. And what I mean by that is that I've tried, there's timing. Is it the right time for the organization to try to approach something? Or hey, I've tried this 20 times at 5 different companies. It's not going to work here. I'm not saying we shouldn't try again, but I think that you just get some of that experiential thing. And I always say I think we've spoken about this. I'm always a big advocate. If people have a passion to do something, go get it, go after it. And my job as the manager or what have you is to, help remove roadblocks and secure the resources and convince whoever needs convincing that that's the right thing to do for the business.
Thank you, David. I appreciate it. Do you think that, those leaders ever go back? I mean, especially with the responsible AI commitments and like sustainable commitments, do you think that those are business decisions, or do you think that there's a kind of boomerang effect of going back into those principles?
What do you mean by that question, Monica?
I guess like my question is about intention.
Okay.
Do you, in your personal opinion, do you think that a lot of executives, and of course we're making generalizations, there's people who like genuinely care about the planet, right?
Sure. And some that genuinely don't.
Yes, right. Generalization. Do you think that, there's a trend going back right now of like, hey, we're going to do our responsible AI commitments and, we're going to put them in our website. And then there's other ones of like, hey, we're going to make a sustainable commitment and we're going to decrease our, footprint and whatnot. Like those commitments, we actually had a speaker that from a, what do you call it, like independent organization that actually helps with those commitments, and they said that she does not see any change coming forward in terms of like leaving those commitments. But I wanted to like get your personal opinion, since you have extensive experience working with executives, of do you think that those commitments come from a like business outcomes perspective mostly, or do you think that there's a shift, like a paradigm shift on corporate thinking into going back and giving back?
I think that, it's a super, thanks for clarifying. I think it's a super interesting question. Let's start with AI ethics. I have this, and I think there's probably a lot of people that would agree. There's one thing to put a set of guidelines on your website, and, lots of companies do that. But I think most companies, at least in the US, they don't even pay just lip service to it. That's sort of where they're at. I think Europe, they've always been, further ahead, the US, with GDPR and the EU AI Act and things like that. So I think there's a lot more work to do in the US. Sustainability, I think I see the similar pattern. Europe seems to be more in tune with that than the US. I think the US is more profit motivated, but I will say I think there is hope, because I see more companies. They call their like a B Corp, and what that means is you bake in these social and societal values into your operating principles. And being in Vermont, Ben and Jerry's was a good one. Before that, and Gardner Supply, and there's beer companies and whatever. There's lots of companies, software companies now that build that into their ethos, and I think that's going to be a long-term competitive advantage for those companies. I think there's certainly companies out there purely motivated by profit, and that's fine. But I feel like it's like almost like in my mind the farm to fork. Like it was like, hey, let's get our food from wherever and ship it in long distances. And now you're seeing it's more, community oriented. So you're not shipping in your food from, halfway around the world. I think companies are realizing that the communities, that's an important part of what they want to do. And I think the smart ones will get that right.
Lovely. Thank you, David. All right. So, we're getting close to the end, and I wanted to close out with one last question. So this question was actually posed by a VP at a really large tech company, because they're putting their own thoughts out there. Mm-hmm. And they asked a question to us about this. And basically, I had to write my answer as part of an assignment at the class. But I wanted to hear from you. It's the year 2050, right? AI has turned out to be hugely beneficial to society and generally acknowledged as such. What happened?
That's a great question. I generally can't think beyond next week, but there's a lot going on in AI right now, right? The biases and it's perpetuating bad things in a lot of cases. I think we're going to fix that, and I think we're going to put the humans back at more of a human-centered design principle, I guess would be the way to call that. There's all you mentioned, sustainability earlier. We now have companies reopening nuclear power plants so they can fuel their AI needs. I think maybe quantum computing is going to address some of that. It's going to be much more efficient. It's not going to be such intensive from an energy consumption. I think people will become more educated, or the AI literacy that you spoke about, data literacy, digital literacy, I think that's going to be baked into the school levels. And I think like digital watermarking technology, I think that's going to help with that. We see the technology's there, and I think it's going to be, if you see something, you should clearly know if it was fake or not. I mean, there's always going to be fraudsters out there that are going to try to game the system, but I think, if you're generating an AI image or whatever, fine, it should be labeled as such, and going on there. In terms of, globally, I have mixed emotions on, if we're going to have like, what role will the UN or some other potential organization play in this? I think in my mind, it comes down to the different cultures and countries have different set of more principles. And so we'll wrestle with that. But I think hopefully, I think there's just a huge potential for AI to be as I guess thought of as another tool, like the internet is. The internet was going to destroy everything when that came out, and we see this over and over again. So I think we're gonna settle down. We're gonna work out the kinks, and like I said, I'm an optimist. So I think people are gonna start to think about it as a tool and use it appropriately.
Nice, thank you.
And what was your answer, Monica? Since you wrote a paper on it.
It was just a couple paragraphs. Actually, we just had a speaker talk about international collaboration of agencies in AI, and actually, my response was very much so influenced by the recent lecture. Mm-hmm. And for me, was establishing a very robust task force, right? One of them is an innovation, and then the other one's an oversight. So both of them work together and against each other, right? Kind of like checks and balances. Okay. So for innovation, they really look into sustainable technology development. They create research centers, and they collaborate with tech companies, and they really make sure that so companies, they will still do their own thing, right? But this innovation task force, it would be focused solely in the benefit of the people from that government. So that's an international coalition, and then every country has their own task force, and it's for the benefit of their own society, for the benefit of their own natural resources, etc. Right? So you're using AI for good, essentially. And then you have the oversight task force, which is it monitors the adherence of ethical standards, privacy, and equitable tech and access. I have a book recommendation that I just started, so I don't know what happens next. Okay. But I started is The Weapons of Mass Destruction by Catherine O'Neill. I'm really excited to go look at it. And then another book, Unmasking AI by Dr. Joe Buolamwini. I finished that one. Excellent book, the best book I've read all year. And really they touch both of them on this type of oversight mechanisms that can happen whether through private or governmental institutions. And they address risks like job displacement and unequal tech distribution, and also misuse of technology. So that's kind of where both of those is hey, let's look for solutions. And then the other one's let's make sure that there's no misuse in anywhere else. And then that coalition, I went a little crazy with the name. I called it the League of Nations of Technological Advancement.
There you go.
And again, I'm very inspired by Dr. Joe Buolamwini's book, because she has a nonprofit called the basically is from the Justice League, so algorithmic justice, and just kind of the parallels there, and essentially they conduct peer reviews. They share privacy frameworks, and they set standards for AI, data privacy, and fair tech access. And then the outcomes from that will be sustainable economic growth, environmental protections, global ethical standards with those frameworks and the peer reviews, and then public trust and adoption. So I do not mean to get political, but the one thing I really love about this politician in Mexico, we so the election had only 2 women. So we have our first woman president, or like
Oh,
presidenta. And the one thing I really love about their how they're doing their policy, one thing is that every morning they go out and they give an overview to the public, and they say what they're working on, they say what happened, and it's just just an overview every single day of what's going on. And I think that that is a great way to create trust with the public and create adoption of whatever initiatives they have. And with that, whatever it is within AI and those coalitions, then that communication one-on-one with the people, I think could be very beneficial.
oh, amazing. Well, Monica, I think we're about at time, but this has been a delightful conversation. I want to thank you wholeheartedly for being the first on the Data Faces podcast. It was a great conversation, and I think our listeners will learn a lot from this. So I appreciate you joining me for the episode number 1.
Thank you, David. Thank you for having me. Had a ton of fun. So,
all right. Have a great day.
You
Cheers.
too. Bye.
Bye.